vitamin C before it was cool?
No. You know my answer to that. Only in private. All right. How's everybody doing? Good. It's good to be here. It's a little bit of a different role, but I like it. So, before I start, I just want to say thank you to all those who have been giving me encouragement this week about speaking and all that stuff. It means a lot. There are a couple of you that kind of went about that in a slightly different way. One said something to the extent of, "Don't screw this up." And then the other one said, "I have a friend coming, so don't just vomit words out of your mouth." So I found that particularly encouraging, and I just wanted to let you know that I appreciate that. So, with that being said, my name is Matt Hummel. I'm a junior here at Westchester. I'm studying middle grades education, and I'm going to put my microphone down. There we go. All right, and it's an honor to be here because I've been sitting in the same seats that you guys have been sitting in for the past 3 years. And so it's a little bit different having to be the one that you actually have to listen to for once. And I do mean you have to listen to me. It is mandatory. We've locked the doors from the outside, so there's really no use trying to escape. So my suggestion would be just to buckle up and get comfortable. So if you're not comfortable with that, then yikes. All right. But on a more serious note, you see me up here pretty much every week giving announcements or telling stories. And in that sense, it's going to be similar. I will be telling a story tonight, but it's going to be a little bit different in nature. I'm going to be talking about grace and how that played a role with my relationship with my dad. And so before we dive in, because we're just going to dive in, let me pray for me real quick. Dear Lord, we just come before you and thank you for this time together. Thank you so much for everybody that came out tonight. And Lord, please calm my nerves. Let me communicate clearly whatever you want everybody to get out of my talk tonight. If there's anything I'm going to say that will distract that purpose, please get rid of it now, and just bless our time together. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Colleen, would you mind throwing that slide up? Yep, 2 things about that picture. One, some of you were probably like, "Oh, he's so cute, what happened?" The second one is, for all of you who I told that I rocked a bowl cut at one time, there's the proof. I wasn't lying, I was serious. And I think it pulled off pretty well. Maybe it's up for debate, but whatever. So, that is a picture of me, my sister, and my dad, and that was around 1995. So, by the looks of it, we were getting presents, so I'm thinking that was Kristen's birthday, and at that point I was at the age where if your sister gets presents, so do you. So, that's a good age to be at. I wish that wouldn't have stopped, but it did. So, let me give you a little background about my life. Actually, before I do that, who here has either grown up in or knows somebody that has grown up in a divorced family? All right, look around real quick. It's a lot, right? It's a lot. Well, that's how I grew up as well. And my parents split around the age of 3 for me. And so that's really all that I remember. That's my life to me. That is my reality. And I went to a Christian school from kindergarten to 12th grade. And it kind of made me feel a little bit like a minority at points. Because even though that was only 10 or 15 years ago, even in the 90s, the divorce rate is not even close to what it is now. And so, you know, when I was looking around and I had all my friends, they had both of their parents together, it made me feel a little bit different. It made me feel a little bit embarrassed to talk about my family situation just because I didn't have the same. So that's kind of how I felt early on, at least in my schooling career. And then, if we're going to fast forward a little bit to around 4th grade, I actually started developing anxiety and panic attacks. And for those of you who haven't had them, they're terrible. They're awful. And especially at that young, I just had no idea how to cope with it. You know, this one time, I just remember being in class and this wave just hit me like a truck. And, you know, I didn't know how to control it, so I went down to the bathroom, I started bawling my eyes out. I just didn't know what on earth was going on. And so, you know, that was rough. That was a tough part of school. I mean, it was rough to go to school sometimes because of that. I would go to the nurse just to get out of school. As a matter of fact, I'd make up excuses for why I needed to go home, or you know, stuff like that. So it was a rough period around that 4th grade time because I just didn't know how to deal with it. Now, if we fast forward again to middle school, I was starting to learn how to deal with the anxiety and learn how to cope with that, but not nearly to the extent that I needed to be functional, in my opinion, at least. And so along the same time, that's when stuff with my dad started to get rough. And I think it was probably a culmination of things, but for me at least, it was just, I was really starting to come to grips with the fact of like what my family dynamic was. And it's not a typical one. And so it was really hard. My dad got to see my sister and I 2 times a month, every other weekend, so that's 4 days a week, or 4 days a month, excuse me. And that's not a long time to build a relationship with anybody, let alone your own parent. And so that was rough, and I think it really was taking a toll on me. And then on top of that, my relationship with my dad was a little bit rocky at that point. I remember specifically one time, my sister had a tournament in Reading for a basketball, and it was a Saturday-Sunday thing, so if they won on Saturday, they'd have to play again on Sunday. And I could tell right off the bat that he wasn't in the best of moods. And I'm pretty observant as it is, but then on top of that with the anxiety, that just heightened my sensitivity to things. So I could tell that he wasn't in the best mood. And then when we actually got to the tournament, I could tell that he was in a slightly worse mood. And at one point, he was expressing to me that he would rather be, doing stuff with us as opposed to watching us play sports on his weekends, just because, that's the only time he gets to see us. And so he arranged for my sister to get a ride home with another parent there, and then him and I just left. And so that was a pretty long car ride because, as you can imagine, the thoughts going through my head, I immediately thought it was something that I did or something that Kristen did. I didn't remember doing anything wrong, so it was confusing. And then, it was just him and I back at the house, and so that was a long 24 hours. That was just me and my thoughts, just kind of thinking about what's going on, what's Kristen gonna think, because she was in the game at the time, like how would she respond to that information. And so I went home the next day to my mom's house, and then I didn't go over and see my dad again for a couple weekends. And so then we went back a couple weeks later, and we never really addressed what had gone on that weekend. And so that was still kind of a question mark to me. And but it went okay. The weekends went fine, and they did so for months. And then something else happened. And then they'd get better, they'd climb up a little bit, and then something else would happen months later. And this cycle continued into my sophomore year of high school. And for the life of me, I can't remember what triggered it or what exactly happened, but I just remember coming home one Sunday, falling on the floor in front of my mom and just crying. And I was just like, that's it, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I quit, I'm done. I cannot have a relationship with this man. For whatever reason, I'm not working out, he's not working out, we're not working out. It's just, I'm done. And that was tough for me, for obvious reasons, but also if you know me, quitting is not really in my mentality. I like to see things through to the end, and I hate giving up on stuff. And so to give up on something is one thing, but then to give up on a family member, specifically your dad, that's another thing. And so that was a tough decision because it was a conscious decision by me. I determined that the inconsistency of my dad's emotions and behaviors and my own inconsistency with my emotions, it just wasn't worth it. The emotional stuff I had to deal with just wasn't worth having a relationship with him. And so that was at the beginning of the summer of my sophomore year going into my junior year. And so for the duration of that summer, we didn't talk. And yeah, we just didn't talk. And so at that point, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. I was trying everything that my 15-year-old self or 16-year-old self knew how to do, and it just wasn't working. And so it was kind of actually a hopeless situation, in my opinion. But yeah, I didn't know what to do. And so with that being said, I want us to quickly turn to 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. And if you don't have your Bible, that's okay, because I have it up on the slide. Probably should have found this ahead of time. That's okay. Alrighty, 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. And that says, "To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. All right, so if we take this apart verse by verse, in verse 7, you're going to notice that Satan is doing something to Paul. He gives him a thorn. And it says conceited in the verse. I think a better word might be exalted. So like it says to keep me from being conceited, but to me that gives me the image of just like on the stuff. And I don't think that's what Paul was saying. I think Paul was saying more so that the people around him were exalting him up. Because at this point in his ministry, he was being given some pretty big revelations and visions by God, and he was using that in a pretty powerful way to the people around him. And so they were putting a lot of stock in what he said, and they're just like, this guy knows his stuff. We're going to listen to him. And so in order to make his ministry less effective, Satan gave him an obstacle. And in verse 8, it says that Paul pleaded 3 times to have this thorn taken away. Now, we don't know exactly what the thorn is. Some scholars said it could be eye problems, it could be migraines, it could be a speech impediment, so it could be physical, but it also could be situational at the same time. It could be people that were just giving him a hard time along the road. It could be the different forms of persecution that he was kind of suffering. But whether or not it was physical or situational, God doesn't give him what he wants. And you can imagine how frustrating this is right off the bat, because this is something that Paul's going to have to deal with every single day of his life. And it's with him constantly. And so God's response in verse 9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for I am strong. I am made strong in weakness." That could have been taken a different way than Paul chooses to take it, because we have the courtesy of looking ahead a verse, but we see that it was ultimately used in a good way, the fact that he had a thorn. But Paul responds to this, not that it was sarcastic. Paul could have taken it as it was sarcastic. When God responds to him and says, "My grace is sufficient for you," Paul could have been like, "Oh, is it now? Real cool, dude. How about I be the judge of that one?" But he didn't. And one of the reasons he didn't is probably because it would be awkward to call God dude. But I think there are probably some other reasons that he didn't take it that way too. But regardless, he took it well. It actually encouraged him. It encouraged him because he knew that whenever he faces adversity, God is strong enough to overcome that. And when he is personally weak, that is an opportunity for God's power to be used through him and give God the glory. And so Paul took that to heart. And he's like, you know what, that's fine. I'm going to deal with this. And that's cool. And so, looking back at this situation, I see a lot of parallels between Paul's story and his situation and my story, my situation. I didn't realize it at the time, but having hindsight, that helps. And I really do see the similarities. I was asking for my relationship with my dad to be reconciled, and I felt like God continued to let that deteriorate, and I couldn't understand why. Thoughts of doubt went through my head, thoughts of, why is this happening to me? I'm trying to be faithful with what you've put in front of me, why? Another thought would be, I'm already from a split home, can you at least give me a functional relationship with my dad? That would be the least you could do. But God didn't do that right away either, and I didn't understand why that was at the time. But fast forwarding back to my story, at the end of the summer that I hadn't talked to my dad for about 3 months, I get a random phone call from my dad. And for the life of me, every fiber of my body said, don't pick up. I had made a stand, I had made a commitment, I was like, no, I'm not going to be a part of this. And so I didn't want to pick up, but then I did. I picked up, and he told me, he's just like, well, let's try to make this work. And again, every fiber in my body was like, say no, don't, like, you've given this a try, you're an idiot if you go back into this, because history repeats itself, and why? Why would you put yourself through that again? You're smarter than that. But again, I said, okay, let's try to do it. And so then we set up a time to meet for dinner, and then we hung up. And the time between that phone call and the time we actually went out to dinner was nerve-wracking. It was just ridiculous. Again, people who know me know I analyze things a lot, and so like just the amount of scenarios that was going through my head was just unbelievable, and most of them were negative, finding out how it could possibly fail this time. But we met, we had dinner, and again, we didn't really discuss why we hadn't talked for a while, but it was a good dinner, we had a good time, and so we set up another time. And then we went to that one, and that went pretty well too, and so we set up another one. We went there, went well, set up another, and it kept going. And I actually found myself liking the idea of having my dad back in my life. But I was always really hesitant too, because I'd been burned in the past, and so I was really hesitant to put my full emotion into really believing that this is going to work. And so I was a little bit reserved for probably the first year or two. But then we moved to the summer of after my senior year, going into my freshman year of college, so 3 years ago. My dad and I were, we were talking at an Applebee's, and we were having lunch, and then he did something that he never did before. He apologized for everything. And that meant a lot to me. It did. We don't forgive people so that they'll say sorry, but it really did mean a lot that he would say he's sorry, because that was an evidence of where he was and where he's come from. And so that meant a lot to me. And so 5 years later, I stand before you, and our relationship is the best it's ever been. We continue to go out to dinner, and we continue to hang out. We just have good talks. I mean, we talk more now about the past and what I feel like we were afraid to talk about before. Actually, it's almost, you almost can't avoid talking about the past when my dad and I get together. And I think that's a wonderful thing, actually. And so I was actually reminded when we went out to dinner over winter break this January. We were going out to dinner, and he just kind of reminded me about how important that dinner at Applebee's was, not only for me, but for him as well. Because I didn't realize this at the time, but that was the first time where he was really allowing himself to forgive himself. And that was the first time he really allowed himself to accept grace. And I think that's really interesting, because it brings up a second side of grace that I don't think we typically think about. We typically think about, if someone wrongs you, then I need to forgive them. I need to extend grace to them. But a lot of times we don't think about the other side and what it might feel like if you did the bad thing and you need to accept that forgiveness and that grace. And so for me, it was really tough to extend grace to my dad because of what had happened, because of the emotional damage that I had suffered. If the God of the universe can do that for me, I have no excuse. I have to extend that to my dad. And on the flip side, we look at accepting grace, which was my dad's side. And that was tough for him too, because he blamed himself for the rift that was in our family. And I think, completely, actually, he blamed himself completely for what happened. And I think that's a little unfair as well, simply because, it was me, my sister, my mom, and my dad. So, we're all parties in this, and we all have something that I'm sure we would want to do better if given the chance. But I think it's unfair for him to blame himself for everything. And for me personally, when I was old enough to make mature decisions, like in high school when I decided not to call my dad back, that was me turning my back on a problem. That was me running away from that. And he still won't let me take responsibility for it, but the difference now is that he's allowing himself to accept forgiveness for it. And so, I actually have a quote I didn't put on the slide. I'm sorry, I pulled one on you. But the quote says, "Grace is the manifestation of Jesus' power exceeding what we could achieve or hope for by our own labors." And so, I'll read that again because that was a lot. Grace is the manifestation of Jesus' power exceeding what we could achieve or hope for by our own labors. So, I take that to mean, in my life, I was unwilling to forgive my dad. I was at the point, I can't stress this to you enough, I was done. That was it. I didn't want to forgive him, and it is literally only God's grace that could transform my attitude from one of, I can't imagine life with my dad, to one of, I can't imagine life without my dad. And that's where grace has kept us. We have a wonderful relationship now, and I can't imagine life without my dad because I love him too much. And it's cool to see the transition from 5 years ago to this point. And like I said, that's really only due to the grace of God, because we tried everything. I tried everything in my power. I'm sure my dad was trying. It just didn't work. It was too big for us. And so, here's another quote, and this one is on the slide. Grace facilitates our abilities to conquer every weakness as we yield to an absolute trust or reliance upon God, trusting His heart even when we cannot trace His hand. So when I picked up the phone call from my dad, I didn't know what good could come from the situation. I was assuming nothing. I was assuming it'd work for a little bit and then it would crash down again. So I had to really trust in the Lord that He would take care of this, because it was clearly out of my control. I've tried and I've failed multiple times. And He did, and He restored that relationship. And like I said, I stand before you with a new relationship with my dad, better than it's ever been. And so I hope you guys can see through that the power of God's grace and His love, because I think we can all relate at some point. There's some situation in our life where you've given everything that you have, and it still hasn't panned out the way you wanted it to. But that's the beauty of having a relationship with a God that's more powerful than your situation, that's more powerful than your circumstance. And so, in order to kind of wrap this up and try to make some sense out of this, I'll say this. We have grace through our faith in Jesus because God loves us. There's nothing that we have done to deserve the grace, and there's nothing that we can do to not get the grace once you have a relationship with Jesus. Jesus' work on the cross, His death, that enables us to accept that free gift of grace. And it's a gift. It's for free. There's no strings attached. We don't have to do anything to get God's favor because Jesus, He's already done that on the cross. And not only is it free, but it's sufficient for all of our circumstances as well. Like I said before, God is bigger than your problems. He's bigger than our circumstances. And He loves you, and He wants to extend that grace to you. So it was hard. It took me a while to appreciate the hardships that I went through with my dad. But I've come to appreciate them for a lot of things. And I think one really cool tidbit that I picked out from it, and I definitely didn't realize it at the time, but I realize it now, is my dad, he never stopped pursuing a relationship with me, even when it got tough. And in the same way, God never stops pursuing a relationship with us. He wants so stinking bad to have a relationship with you. He doesn't care what you do wrong. He doesn't care how many times you're going to mess up. He just wants a relationship with you, and He's willing to extend His grace in that relationship. And so we looked at two main actions of grace that are kind of tough, the giving and the receiving. For me, it was tough to give because of what had happened, and for my dad, it was tough to receive because of what had happened. And it wasn't until the point where we both were able to accept and receive grace that that relationship was healed completely. And the same thing goes for all of us in any situation. If you are unwilling to accept the grace and forgiveness that someone's going to give to you, you're never going to be completely healed. If you never extend grace to people that have done wrong by you, you're never going to get healed completely. It's a necessary action to get that complete healing. And so I want to leave you with two questions. The first of which is, up on the slide, is there someone that you need to extend grace to? And if so, what's keeping you from doing that? Is there someone in your life that has done wrong to you emotionally, physically, verbally, whatever? Is there someone that's done something to you and you're kind of harboring resentment and you're not extending the grace that God has given to you? Because if that's so, I would encourage you to take a look at yourself and see why that is. And then also take a look at the Lord and see, has He ever withheld His grace from you? The answer to that is no. And so, what right do you have to withhold that from somebody else? The second question relates more to my dad's situation. Is there something, or do you need to accept grace for something or from someone, including yourself? Do you feel like you have done something that is far beyond forgiveness, that is far too bad to ever warrant forgiveness? Because again, I would question that logic, and I would say no. God is willing to forgive no matter what. He expects us to mess up. He realizes this, and He loves us anyway. Nothing is too big for God. And so if you're struggling with that, definitely look at that in your own life too, and see, should I be accepting grace for something that I've done? And so I didn't get it at the time, why I had to go through the stuff I had to go through with my dad. I didn't get it. Didn't understand it. I was like, I was a straight, pretty straight arrow kid. Like, good stuff shouldn't happen to bad people. And, all right, yeah, that stuff shouldn't happen to good people. You guys were nice. You delayed your laugh for a little. That was kind of, so, you know, I couldn't understand why that was happening to me because I considered myself pretty good. But what I failed to realize was that God sees the big picture more so than us. He has a bigger and broader perspective than we do. And he saw what this situation was going to do for both me and my dad. And who I am today is shaped by the experiences that I've had to go through. And I'm not perfect, but I'm happy with who I am. And I think God's happy with who I am too. And for that, that's good enough for me. And I wouldn't change it for the world. And so, on top of that, now I can share what I've learned with other people. Tonight, it's with you guys. So there are reasons why we go through persecution. There are reasons why we go through hard times. We just have to be willing to weather the storm, rely on God, and try to see with a broader perspective than what's right in front of us. Trust in God's heart, even when you cannot trace his hand. Let's pray. Lord, I just want to thank you for this time. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with all these people. Lord, it's just an auditorium full of people that I love and care for. And so I just want to thank you for putting me in a position to be able to share this stuff. I would also like to thank you for just the transformation that has gone on in my life and my dad's life. And Lord, it's true that we can only attribute that change to you. And so, Lord, as we move forward and